The first rays of morning light streamed through the dusty blinds of a cramped apartment in downtown Boston, illuminating the face of a woman who sat motionless, staring at a check she couldn't cash. Eleanor Montgomery's silver hair fell loose around her shoulders, uncombed for days, her once impeccable posture now curved with the weight of recent defeat. The paper trembled in her hands. The final payment from Montgomery Estates, the company she had built over 4 decades, now bearing someone else's signature. 62 years old, and in one cruel sweep, I lost everything. The beachfront villa in Malibu, the Manhattan penthouse, my collection of vintage cars, and most painfully, my children's trust. $8 million. Gone. And Richard took it all without even having the decency to look me in the eye when the gavel fell. Ellie placed the check on the scratched coffee table she'd purchased from a second-hand store 3 days ago. The furniture in this one-bedroom rental barely filled the space, a testament to how quickly life could be stripped to its bare essentials. Her designer clothes had been replaced with department store basics, her Italian leather handbag with a canvas tote. The gold wedding band that had graced her finger for 7 years now sat in a pawn shop across town, having paid for this month's rent. The television hummed in the background, a local news station she kept on for company in the endless silence. The financial segment caught her attention, not because she still had investments to monitor, but because a familiar face appeared on screen. Richard Barrett stood confidently at the ribbon cutting of Montgomery Estates' newest luxury development. His arm was casually draped around Jessica Harlow's shoulder, their matching smiles gleaming with victory. The caption identified Jessica simply as legal counsel, with no mention of the personal relationship Ellie had discovered that rainy Tuesday afternoon when she'd returned to the office unexpectedly. How quickly they'd shed any pretense once they'd won. They hadn't even waited a respectable interval before flaunting their relationship. The development they celebrated had been Ellie's vision. 18 months of planning, negotiations, and passion poured into what would have been the crown jewel of her career. Now Richard stood there 15 years her junior, claiming her life's work as his own innovative direction for the company. The remote control cracked in Ellie's grip, her knuckles white with restrained fury. She switched off the television, plunging the apartment into silence. 14 years as a widow, rebuilding the company her husband James had left behind, only to lose it to a man she'd welcomed into her bed, her home, and worst of all, into her company's confidential files. The betrayal stung like salt in an open wound. Ellie's mind drifted to the day she met Richard 7 years earlier at a charity gala for downtown restoration. His charm had been immediate, intellectual, ambitious, with just enough humility to seem grounded despite his youth. After 15 years of widowhood, the attention had been intoxicating. He'd pursued her with single-minded focus, seemingly unbothered by their age difference, impressed by her business acumen rather than intimidated. Looking back, she should have seen the calculation behind those admiring glances. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of theater nights, weekend getaways, and long conversations about architecture and urban development. Richard's supposed passion. Within a year, they were married in an intimate ceremony on her estate's grounds. William, her eldest at 38, had walked her down the aisle with visible reluctance. Catherine and Jennifer, her daughters, had stood as bridesmaids, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. A knock at the apartment door jolted Ellie from her memories. She straightened her blouse, a plain cotton button-down that hung loose on her frame after weeks of barely eating, and opened the door to find Mrs. Petrovich, her elderly neighbor, holding a covered dish. "I'm not taking charity," Eleanor wanted to say, but the kindness in the old woman's eyes disarmed her defenses. Mrs. Petrovich pushed the dish forward. "My grandmother's recipe. Sometimes when the world feels too heavy, a good meal makes it lighter for a few minutes." Ellie accepted the offering, realizing she couldn't remember her last proper meal. "Thank you. I'll return your dish tomorrow." The door closed and Ellie carried the food to her kitchenette. The scent of home cooking filled the small space, bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. She'd employed a personal chef for years, hosting dinner parties that had been the talk of Boston's elite. Now she stood in a rented apartment smaller than her former walk-in closet, accepting casseroles from neighbors who knew nothing of her past life. Her cell phone rang, an older model she'd purchased after Richard had somehow gained control of her previous accounts. The screen displayed William Montgomery, and her heart leapt with hope. Her son had been avoiding her calls since the trial, convinced by Richard that his mother had grown unstable, unable to manage the company his grandfather had founded. "Mother." William's voice carried the formality he'd adopted since the divorce proceedings began. "I'm calling about grandmother's pearls. Catherine's wedding anniversary is next month, and the pearls should go to her as we'd always planned." Ellie sank into a chair, her free hand instinctively reaching for her neck, where those pearls had rested on special occasions for decades. The family heirloom had been among the few personal items she'd managed to keep during the settlement. Those pearls were meant for Catherine on her 40th birthday, not her 10th anniversary. Your grandmother was explicit about that tradition. There was a pause. Then William's voice hardened. Things change, Mother. Catherine needs something positive right now. The company restructuring has been difficult for everyone. Restructuring, is that what Richard's calling it? He systematically pushed me out of my own company with Jessica's legal maneuvering. We've been through this. The paperwork was clear. You signed everything voluntarily. If you'd been paying attention instead of treating the company like your personal social club. William had adopted Richard's phrasing, his perspective. The distance in her son's voice cut deeper than any courtroom loss. The pearls are all I have left of your grandmother. They're staying with me until Catherine turns 40 as intended. Fine. I'll tell her you refused. Again. The call ended and Ellie stared at the phone. She had raised her children in privilege, given them every opportunity, carried the family business through the hardest years after James died. Now they viewed her as an obstacle and embarrassment, a woman past her prime who needed to step aside gracefully. She placed the phone down and moved to the apartment's single window. Outside Boston's financial district gleamed in the distance, the Montgomery Building's distinctive copper dome visible against the skyline. Her father-in-law had commissioned that building in the 1970s, insisted on the dome despite the additional cost. Something that lasts needs to inspire, he'd told her once. Now it belonged to Richard along with everything else she had built. Night fell, and Ellie found herself unable to sleep, pacing the small apartment in darkness. The walls seemed to close in with each passing hour. The settlement had left her with just enough to survive for perhaps a year if she was frugal, a concept foreign to a woman who had never checked price tags. She had approached several law firms about challenging the verdict, but none would take her case. Jessica Harlow's reputation in Boston's legal community was formidable, her connections extensive. When dawn broke, Ellie made a decision. She would not remain in Boston watching her life's work flourish in another's hands. She would visit her sister in Connecticut, regroup, and plan her next steps. First, though, she needed to retrieve the few personal items still in storage. The facility manager had called yesterday with a final notice. The storage fees hadn't been paid in 3 months, and everything would be auctioned if she didn't clear it out within 48 hours. Ellie counted her remaining cash, barely enough for the bus fare, and perhaps a moving van if she found the cheapest option. She'd need to borrow money. The thought turned her stomach, but pride would leave her with nothing but photographs of a life now beyond reach. Mrs. Petrovich answered her knock immediately, as if she'd been waiting. The loan of $200 was offered without hesitation, along with a nephew's truck and his assistance. I'll pay you back next week when my pension arrives, the old woman insisted, crafting a fiction that preserved Ellie's dignity. The storage facility stood on the outskirts of Boston, a sprawling complex of metal units baking in the summer heat. Ellie's unit, once one of the largest available, contained what remained of her personal history. Family photographs, James's collection of first edition novels, the children's baby books and school mementos, items deemed of no significant financial value by the court yet priceless in memory. Mrs. Petrovich's nephew, Anton, a quiet man in his 40s, helped Ellie sort through the unit. What will you keep, Mrs. Montgomery? We don't have room for everything. The reality of her new limitations hit Ellie like a physical blow. She would need to abandon pieces of her history, select only what could fit in a small apartment, already furnished with secondhand basics. The photographs, my husband's books, the children's memory boxes. Her voice caught. And that trunk in the corner, it belonged to my father-in-law. The trunk was heavy, its brass fittings tarnished with age. Maxwell Montgomery had left it to Ellie upon his death, insisting it contained family wisdom for when it was needed most. She had kept it unopened out of respect for the man who had welcomed her into the Montgomery family when she married James nearly 40 years earlier. Anton loaded the selected items onto his truck, leaving behind furniture, artwork, and designer clothing that had once defined Ellie's carefully curated life. Each abandoned piece felt like amputating a memory. The antique desk where she'd written letters to James during his final hospital stay, the hand-knotted Persian rug they'd found on their 20th anniversary trip, the oil painting of Boston Harbor, commissioned from a local artist they'd discovered, and later helped become nationally recognized. Back at the apartment, Ellie directed Anton to place Maxwell's trunk in the corner of her bedroom. She would examine it later when the pain of sorting through her diminished life had subsided. For now, she focused on arranging the photographs, creating a small gallery of happier days along the apartment's main wall. James on their wedding day, William's college graduation, Catherine holding her first architectural award, Jennifer completing the Boston Marathon, family Christmases at the estate spanning decades of prosperity and connection. The wall became a timeline of a life now severed, a visual reminder of everything Richard had stolen. Not just the material wealth, but the family unity, the respect she'd earned, the legacy she'd protected and expanded. That evening, Ellie sat with Maxwell's trunk, running her fingers over the worn leather and brass fittings. Maxwell Montgomery had been a formidable man. Stern but fair, demanding excellence while rewarding initiative. He had built Montgomery Estates from nothing, transforming a small construction company into one of Boston's premier real estate development firms. When James died unexpectedly at 52, Maxwell had supported Ellie's decision to step into leadership rather than sell the company, despite initial skepticism from the board. He'd mentored her, challenged her, and ultimately respected her as she guided the company through the 2008 financial crisis without laying off a single employee. Before his death at 91, he'd told her she had exceeded his expectations, high praise from a man who rarely offered compliments. The trunk's lock was stiff with disuse. Ellie found a small keyring in her purse, one of the few personal items she'd had with her the day the court officers had escorted her from her home. The smallest key fit the trunk's lock, turning with reluctance after decades of neglect. Inside the trunk contained an assortment of items, carefully preserved photographs from the 1940s and 50s, letters bound with faded ribbon, a worn leather journal, and business ledgers from Montgomery Construction's earliest days. Beneath these lay a small wooden box and a sealed envelope with Ellie's name written in Maxwell's distinctive handwriting. The letter was dated 15 years earlier, shortly before his death. Ellie broke the seal, unfolding pages that crackled with age. Eleanor, if you're reading this, you've encountered a situation dire enough to open this trunk. I've observed your strength through James's illness and death, watched you take the reins of my company with determination, despite the doubts of men who underestimated you. Whatever has brought you to this moment, remember this. Montgomery men and women do not surrender to circumstances. I was 38 when I lost everything in 1947. The construction company I'd built from nothing collapsed when my business partner embezzled our capital and fled to South America. My wife was expecting our second child, your father-in-law Robert. Creditors took our home, our car, even my wife's jewelry. Society cast us aside, former friends suddenly unreachable. What few knew was that my father, a cabinet maker who survived the Great Depression through frugality and foresight, had established a small account for me when I started my business. For the darkest day, he said. I had forgotten it existed until we lost everything. Inside the wooden box, you'll find what remains of that legacy. A reminder that sometimes salvation comes from generations past, from those who weathered their own storms and prepared for ours. Whatever difficulties you face, Eleanor faced them with the dignity and resilience that impressed me from the first day James brought you home. You are a Montgomery not just by marriage, but by character. With respect and confidence, Maxwell. Ellie set the letter aside with trembling hands, reaching for the wooden box. Inside lay a banking card yellowed with age and a small booklet from First National Bank of Boston dated 1948. The booklet contained transaction records spanning just a few months, then nothing, as if the account had been opened, funded, and then forgotten. Could it still exist after all these years? The bank itself had been absorbed by larger institutions, decades ago merged and renamed through financial consolidation. Even if the account remained, it likely contained a pittance, a few $100s at most, hardly enough to rebuild a life. Yet something in Maxwell's letter kindled a flicker of hope. The man had never been prone to sentimentality or false reassurance. If he had preserved this account information specifically for the darkest day, perhaps it held more significance than appeared. Ellie spent the rest of the night examining the trunk's contents. The journal detailed Maxwell's rebuilding after his financial collapse. The second construction company started with minimal capital. The strategic partnerships formed the careful growth managed over decades. He had risen from total ruin to create an empire, starting over at an age when most considered their career trajectories fixed. She recognized herself in the pages. The same determination she'd shown after James died, the same strategic thinking she'd applied to modernize Montgomery Estates for the 21st century. The qualities Richard had initially admired, then systematically undermined as he positioned himself to take control. Morning brought renewed purpose. Ellie dressed in her most professional remaining outfit, a navy blazer showing slight wear at the elbows, a simple white blouse, and gray slacks. She pulled her silver hair into a neat chignon, applied minimal makeup, and squared her shoulders before the mirror. The woman who stared back looked tired but resolute, a shadow of her former polished appearance but with a dignity that transcended circumstance. The bus ride to downtown Boston took 45 minutes, each stop a reminder of her changed status. She had driven luxury vehicles for decades, garage kept and professionally maintained. Now she sat among commuters invisible as only an older woman without obvious wealth could be in a city that valued youth and financial success. National Trust Bank occupied an imposing neoclassical building in Boston's financial district, ironically just 2 blocks from the Montgomery building where she was no longer welcome. The marble lobby gleamed under crystal chandeliers, the space designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. Ellie approached the reception desk, her posture deliberately erect, her expression composed. "I need to speak with someone regarding a potentially dormant account from 1948. The young receptionist barely glanced up from her computer. Account services is on the 3rd floor, but accounts inactive for over 7 years are usually escheated to the state. This account may be an exception. I'd prefer to speak with a senior manager." Something in Ellie's tone, the quiet authority she had cultivated through decades of corporate leadership, caused the receptionist to look up properly. She studied Ellie for a moment, noting the quality of the blazer despite its wear, the natural confidence in her bearing. "I'll see if Ms. Wilson is available. She handles our heritage accounts. Your name, please." "Eleanor Montgomery." The receptionist's eyes widened slightly at the Montgomery name, still recognizable in Boston's business community despite recent events. She made a discreet call, speaking too quietly for Ellie to hear the conversation. "Ms. Wilson will see you. Please take the elevator to the 4th floor suite 412. Rebecca Wilson's office reflected her senior position. Spacious with a view of Boston Harbor, decorated in understated luxury that spoke of old money and institutional permanence. The woman herself appeared to be in her late 50s, with auburn hair streaked with gray and shrewd eyes that assessed Ellie immediately. "Mrs. Montgomery." Rebecca rose from behind her desk, extending her hand. "This is an unexpected pleasure. Please have a seat. How can I help you today?" Ellie maintained her composure, determined not to appear desperate despite the circumstances. "I recently discovered documents regarding an account opened by my father-in-law, Maxwell Montgomery, in 1948. I understand your institution absorbed First National Bank of Boston sometime in the 1980s. I'm curious whether the account might still exist." Rebecca's professional smile remained fixed, but her eyes reflected skepticism. "That's quite some time ago. Do you have the account information?" Ellie removed the yellowed banking card and booklet from her purse, placing them carefully on the desk. The booklet's faded First National Bank logo was barely discernible after decades of storage. Rebecca examined the documents with growing interest, her fingers tracing the account number with professional care. "This is from our predecessor institution, certainly. Quite a historical artifact in itself." She glanced up at Ellie. "May I ask how you came to have these documents now after all this time?" "My father-in-law left them in my care before his death 15 years ago. I only recently had cause to examine them closely." Understanding flickered across Rebecca's features. The recent headlines about Montgomery Estate's change in leadership had been prominently featured in Boston's business publications, though the articles had favored Richard's perspective of necessary modernization rather than the truth of manipulation and betrayal. "Let me see what our system shows. This will take some time. Records this old would have been migrated through several system conversions." Rebecca began typing, navigating through the bank's databases with practiced efficiency. Ellie sat motionless, trying to manage her expectations. The account likely held sentimental rather than financial value, a touchstone to Maxwell's resilience rather than actual resources for her own recovery. The minutes stretched uncomfortably as Rebecca's search deepened, phone calls were made, and additional security verifications processed. Ellie's hope diminished with each passing moment. Perhaps the account had been closed decades ago, or reduced to nothing through inactivity fees. Finally, Rebecca set down her phone and studied Ellie with an expression that had transformed from professional courtesy to genuine astonishment. "Mrs. Montgomery, I need to verify your identity further before proceeding. This is highly unusual. Do you have government-issued identification?" Ellie produced her driver's license, watching as Rebecca made photocopies and entered additional information into her computer. The banker's demeanor had shifted, a new deference in her manner, a careful precision to her movements. "Mrs. Montgomery, the account does indeed still exist." Rebecca's voice had lowered, as if sharing confidential information, despite them being alone in her office. In fact, it appears to be a rather specialized trust account that was established with specific instructions for maintenance and investment. Ellie's pulse quickened. And what might the current balance be? Rebecca turned her monitor so Ellie could see the screen. The figure displayed caused Ellie's breath to catch disbelief, momentarily overwhelming her practiced composure. There must be some mistake. No mistake, Mrs. Montgomery. Your father-in-law established this account with an initial deposit of $10,000 in 1948, a significant sum at that time. He provided specific investment instructions that were quite visionary for the period. The account was set up to reinvest all earnings automatically into a diversified portfolio heavily weighted toward what we would now call blue-chip stocks. Rebecca scrolled through the account history. The documentation indicates that Maxwell Montgomery explicitly instructed that the account should remain untouched, with a notation that it was insurance against catastrophe for future generations. The only withdrawal authorization required presentation of the original bank card and verification that the presenter was a Montgomery by birth or marriage. The current balance stood at $23.75 for 1237. Tears welled in Ellie's eyes before she could prevent them. She had entered the bank expecting at most a few $100s, a symbolic connection to Maxwell's past struggles. Instead, she had discovered a fortune, one that Richard knew nothing about, that had never been included in any company records or family financial discussions. Maxwell Montgomery, it seemed, had understood the cyclical nature of fortune and devastation. He had created a safety net that had quietly grown for over 70 years, waiting for the moment when it would be most needed. Rebecca discreetly pushed a box of tissues toward Ellie. Your father-in-law appears to have been quite forward-thinking, Mrs. Montgomery. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. I'm familiar with the recent changes at Montgomery Estates. Perhaps this discovery comes at an opportune time. Ellie dabbed at her eyes, her mind already racing with possibilities. The amount wouldn't restore everything she had lost. The company itself had been valued at over $50 million, but it represented freedom, resources, a foundation from which to rebuild. I'll need time to consider the best approach. For now, I'd prefer complete confidentiality regarding this account. Rebecca nodded, professional discretion reasserting itself. Of course, we can discuss your options for accessing these funds when you're ready. Would you like me to prepare initial paperwork today? Not yet. Ellie felt a strange calm settling over her, the clarity that comes with sudden reversal of fortune. For the first time since the trial, she felt the weight of defeat lifting. I'll return tomorrow after I've had time to think. For now, knowing the account exists is enough. As Ellie rose to leave, Rebecca offered her card with a direct line number scrawled on the back. Call me anytime, Mrs. Montgomery. I'd be happy to accommodate your schedule. The deference in Rebecca's manner was subtle but unmistakable. The respect accorded to a woman of means, not the dismissive courtesy shown to the desperate. Ellie had almost forgotten how it felt to be treated as someone who mattered. Outside the bank, Boston's summer heat enveloped her as she walked slowly toward the bus stop. The Montgomery building gleamed in the distance, its copper dome catching the midday sun. Ellie studied it with new eyes, not as something irrevocably lost, but as a benchmark for what could be built anew. She bypassed the bus stop, continuing toward Boston Common. The park stretched before her, a green oasis amid urban concrete. Ellie found an empty bench beneath a sprawling oak tree, its shade offering respite from the summer heat. She sat with her back straight, hands folded in her lap, observing the world around her with renewed attention. Young professionals hurried past with takeout lunches, students sprawled on the grass with textbooks. Tourists consulted maps and took photographs. Life continued its relentless forward motion, heedless of personal catastrophes or unexpected resurrections. For 7 weeks, Ellie had been drowning in loss, each day a struggle to process how thoroughly her life had been dismantled. Now, with Maxwell's unexpected gift, she felt solid ground beneath her feet for the first time since the judge's ruling. $23 million. Not enough to reclaim everything, but sufficient to ensure she would never again accept charity casseroles or borrow money for bus fare. Enough to secure proper legal representation. Enough, perhaps, to begin again at 62. Ellie pulled out her phone and searched for Jonathan Fisher, attorney, Boston. Jonathan had been a contemporary at Harvard Law, a formidable litigator who had crossed paths with Jessica Harlow in several high-profile cases before his semi-retirement 5 years earlier. He had reached out after the verdict, offering sympathy, but no false hope given the seemingly ironclad documentation Jessica had orchestrated. His office answered on the second ring, his assistant's voice professionally neutral, until Ellie identified herself. Mr. Fisher is not taking new clients at this time, Mrs. Montgomery. but he asked me to put you through if you ever called. Jonathan's familiar baritone filled the line moments later. Eleanor, I've been hoping you'd call. How are you holding up? Better than expected, actually. I've had a rather interesting morning. Are you available for lunch today? My treat. A pause, then a chuckle. Well, that's a change in tone from our last conversation. I'm intrigued. The Oak Room at the Fairmont 1 hour. The Oak Room had been one of Ellie's regular lunch venues before everything collapsed. An elegant establishment where Boston's business elite conducted deals over expense account meals. She hesitated mentally, calculating the cost against her limited funds, then remembered the figure on Rebecca's monitor. Perfect. I'll see you then. Ellie ended the call and contemplated her appearance. Her outfit, while presentable, wouldn't meet the Oak Room's unstated standards. She checked the time. Enough for a quick visit to Neiman Marcus, where she had once been welcomed by name by eager sales associates. 90 minutes later, Ellie entered the Oak Room wearing a new Chanel suit in charcoal gray, her silver hair freshly styled, minimal but precise makeup refreshing her appearance. The maitre d' recognized her immediately, surprise flickering across his features before professional discretion reasserted itself. Mrs. Montgomery, how lovely to see you again. Mr. Fisher is already seated. Jonathan Fisher rose as Ellie approached the table, his tall frame still imposing despite his 70 years. His silver hair and tailored suit projected the confidence of a man who had never questioned his place in the world. He studied Ellie with shrewd eyes that missed nothing, the new suit the restored confidence in her bearing. You look remarkably well for someone who lost everything 7 weeks ago. Either you're an exceptional actress or something has changed. Ellie smiled, settling into her chair with practiced elegance. I've had an unexpected development, one that might interest you professionally. Over lunch, Dover sole for him, lobster salad for her, a bottle of Montrachet they both appreciated. Ellie recounted her discovery of Maxwell's hidden account. Jonathan listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful as he processed the implications. Your father-in-law was a remarkable man. This changes your position considerably, though not completely. The company remains in Richard's control through legally binding documents, most of which contain my signatures, some authentic, others questionable. Ellie kept her voice low, mindful of neighboring tables. I never authorized the restructuring that gave Richard controlling interest. Those documents appeared after Jessica began spending more time at the office. Jonathan's eyebrows rose. You're suggesting forgery. That's a serious allegation, Eleanor. I'm stating it plainly. Richard and Jessica systematically defrauded me using my trust and Jessica's legal expertise to transfer my life's work into his name. I want it back, Jonathan. Not just for me, but for my children and grandchildren. This is their heritage. Jonathan sipped his wine, considering. If you're right about the forgeries, we might have grounds to challenge the settlement. It won't be easy. Jessica has significant influence in Boston's courts. Ellie leaned forward, her voice steady. I have something Jessica doesn't. The truth. And now, thanks to Maxwell, I have the resources to pursue it properly. 23 million reasons why this fight isn't over. Jonathan studied her professional assessment, giving way to genuine respect. You've always been formidable, Eleanor. I underestimated you 7 weeks ago. Richard may have made the same mistake. As they discussed strategy, Ellie felt a sense of purpose crystallizing. Maxwell's hidden account wasn't just financial salvation. It was vindication of the qualities he had valued in her. Resilience, foresight, determination. The very attributes Richard had systematically undermined during their marriage, subtly eroding her confidence until she began delegating decisions that should have remained hers. The Montgomery legacy wouldn't end with Richard's theft. It would continue through her, not as the defeated ex-wife, but as the architect of her own resurrection. Jonathan agreed to represent her, his semi-retirement immediately suspended for what he termed the most interesting case I've encountered in years. They would begin with forensic document examination proving that key signatures had been forged. They would investigate Richard and Jessica's relationship timeline, establishing that their collaboration predated the supposed restructuring. They would build a case methodically, irrefutably, leaving nothing to chance. I'll assemble a team immediately. Jonathan signaled for the check. This won't be quick or easy, Eleanor. Jessica will fight with everything she has. Her reputation depends on it. Ellie nodded, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I've waited 62 years to discover who I truly am, Jonathan. I can wait a little longer for justice. That evening, Ellie sat in her small apartment surrounded by the photographs of her former life. Tomorrow, she would begin looking for a more suitable residence. Not the ostentatious display of wealth she had once maintained, but something befitting a woman of means who understood the transient nature of fortune. She would access enough of Maxwell's fund to ensure comfort and proper legal representation, leaving the bulk untouched as he had for so many decades. Her phone chimed with a message from William. Catherine was disappointed about the pearls. Richard suggested we contest grandmother's will provisions next. Ellie felt a momentary surge of anger quickly replaced by calm determination. Her children had been manipulated by Richard, their loyalty leveraged against her through carefully constructed narratives about her competence and stability. They would learn the truth eventually, not through her desperate assertions, but through incontrovertible evidence and legal vindication. She typed a simple response: family legacies matter. Sometimes they reveal themselves when most needed. Placing her phone aside, Ellie opened Maxwell's journal again, finding comfort in the precise handwriting of a man who had faced devastation and emerged stronger. One passage particularly resonated. True wealth isn't measured by what you display, but by what you withhold. The resources others don't know you possess, knowledge, patience, strategic reserves, these are the true foundations of power. The world sees only what you allow it to see. Maxwell had understood this principle 70 years earlier, creating a financial sanctuary unknown to anyone until it was needed most. Ellie would honor that wisdom, rebuilding her life with the same quiet determination, the same strategic foresight. Richard believed he had stripped her of everything: her home, her company, her dignity, even her children's respect. He couldn't imagine that in losing everything she had discovered, something far more valuable, her own capacity for resurrection. In the corner of her bedroom, Maxwell's trunk stood as a tangible reminder that legacies transcended temporary defeats. The Montgomery resilience hadn't died with the court's ruling. It had merely been dormant, waiting for the moment when it would be most needed. Ellie closed the journal and moved to the window, gazing toward the financial district where the Montgomery building's dome caught the last light of day. Richard might occupy the offices her family had built, sign papers at the desk, where 3 generations of Montgomerys had conducted business, but he would never embody the true Montgomery spirit. That legacy lived in her, the widow who had guided the company through recession, the mother who had balanced corporate leadership with family devotion, the woman who had risen from devastating loss once before and would do so again. Tomorrow would bring the first steps toward reclaiming what was rightfully hers, not through emotional outbursts or public accusations, but through the methodical, strategic approach that had defined her professional success. Richard and Jessica believed they had defeated a woman too old and trusting to defend herself. They would soon discover their grave miscalculation. At 62, Eleanor Montgomery wasn't finished. She was merely beginning again, armed with wisdom hard-won and resources long preserved. The copper dome that had once symbolized her family's achievement would eventually reflect her own personal renaissance, a testament not just to Montgomery resilience, but to her individual strength. Maxwell's final gift wasn't merely financial security. It was the opportunity to define herself beyond the roles of wife, widow, mother, or executive. To discover who Eleanor Montgomery truly was when everything familiar had been stripped away and what she could build from the foundation of that authentic self. The night deepened around her, but for the first time in 7 weeks, darkness brought possibility rather than despair. Ellie Montgomery had lost an empire but found her purpose. The reckoning that awaited Richard and Jessica would be executed not with vengeance, but with the quiet, devastating precision of justice, long delayed but ultimately served. 3 weeks after discovering Maxwell's hidden account, Ellie stood in the lobby of the Bristol, one of Boston's premier residential buildings. The doorman welcomed her with deference as she crossed the marble floor to the elevator bank. The 2-bedroom apartment on the 12th floor wasn't as expansive as her former mansion, but its understated elegance better suited her current priorities. The space offered breathtaking harbor views without ostentatious display, a sanctuary from which to plan her resurrection. The first withdrawal from Maxwell's account had been carefully considered, enough to secure proper housing, retain Jonathan Fisher's legal team, and restore basic financial stability without depleting the core resource. The remainder continued to grow under Rebecca Wilson's management, the banking executive having become an unexpected ally in Ellie's strategic planning. Ellie slipped off her shoes as she entered the apartment, savoring the feeling of polished hardwood beneath her feet. The space remained minimally furnished, quality pieces selected for comfort rather than impression. The conspicuous consumption that had once defined her lifestyle now seemed hollow, a distraction from what truly mattered. The dining table was covered with documents organized in precise stacks: financial records, company reports, personal correspondence spanning decades. Ellie had begun a forensic examination of her own life, tracking the subtle shifts in company control that had culminated in Richard's coup. The timeline was damning when viewed in retrospect, Jessica's involvement evident long before their relationship became public. Ellie picked up a company memo dated 18 months earlier, Jessica's first suggested restructuring document. The language seemed innocuous, even beneficial, proposing changes to protect company assets during a planned expansion. What it actually accomplished, however, was creating a separate holding entity that Richard would later control. The first thread in a complex web designed to ensnare decades of Montgomery work. A knock at the door interrupted her analysis. The private investigator she'd hired, Michael Donovan, a former police detective with a reputation for discretion, stood in the hallway holding a manila envelope. "You asked for surveillance on Barrett and Harlow. I've got something interesting." Donovan stepped inside, placing the envelope on the entry console. They've established a pattern of meeting at her condo Tuesday and Thursday evenings, then the Beacon Hill Club on Sundays for brunch. But yesterday they had an unscheduled meeting at the Four Seasons bar. It didn't look friendly. Ellie opened the envelope, examining photographs showing Richard and Jessica in what appeared to be a heated discussion. Richard's face was flushed with anger, Jessica's expression coldly defensive. The final image captured Jessica leaving alone, Richard remaining at the bar ordering what appeared to be a double scotch. Trouble in paradise. Ellie kept her tone neutral despite the flicker of satisfaction. Donovan shrugged. "The bartender's an old friend. Says they were arguing about money. Barrett accusing Harlow of taking more than her share from something called the Montgomery arrangement." Ellie's pulse quickened. The betrayal had apparently extended beyond her marriage. Richard and Jessica's partnership showing its first cracks under pressure. Jonathan Fisher had filed the initial legal challenge 3 days earlier, requesting forensic examination of key documents. Word would have reached Jessica immediately. "I need everything you can get on their conversations, especially anything about document preparation or signatures, and continue tracking their movements. I want to know if they meet with any of the board members or my children." Donovan nodded, his expression professional, but his eyes revealing grudging admiration. "Most clients in your situation get emotional, want embarrassing photos for divorce leverage. You're building something different. I'm not interested in embarrassment, Mr. Donovan. I want justice. The kind that stands up in court and business circles long after emotions fade." After he left, Ellie returned to the documents, energy renewed. The initial shock of betrayal had crystallized into focused determination. Richard had underestimated her, dismissing her as a woman past her prime, too trusting, too emotional to fight effectively. His miscalculation would prove fatal to his ambitions. The intercom buzzed, the doorman announcing Jonathan Fisher's arrival. Moments later, the attorney entered, carrying his worn leather briefcase, a deliberate anachronism in an age of sleek technology, much like the man himself. The forensic document examiner found discrepancies in the signatures on 6 key transfers. Jonathan placed a folder on the table, opening it to reveal side-by-side comparisons of signatures. 3 appear conclusively forged. The others show signs of guided hand signatures, someone physically directing your hand while you signed, likely on different documents than what was ultimately filed. Ellie examined the evidence, memory stirring of late nights reviewing routine paperwork Richard had brought home. "I remember signing documents he said were insurance renewals and vendor contracts. He'd stack them together, flag the signature lines, bring me coffee, and likely something stronger than coffee." Jonathan's expression hardened. "The timing correlates with your physician prescribing anxiety medication after your brother's death last year. Barrett may have exploited your grief and the medication's effects." The realization sent ice through Ellie's veins. The calculated nature of the betrayal extending beyond business manipulation into intimate exploitation of her most vulnerable moments. Richard had weaponized her trust, her grief, even her health. "We'll need my medical records, prescription history, and any witnesses to my condition during that period." Ellie's voice remained steady despite the fresh wound. "And we should examine the timing of Jessica's involvement more closely. She began representing the company 8 years ago, but only started suggesting restructuring after Richard and I married." Jonathan nodded, impressed by her analytical approach, despite the personal implications. The legal strategy was taking shape. Not a simple case of marital betrayal, but a documented conspiracy to defraud a company principal through multiple avenues of deception. The preliminary hearing is scheduled for next month. Judge Martinez will review our request for document examination and deposition authority. Jessica's firm has already filed a motion to dismiss, claiming these are settled matters from the divorce proceedings. Ellie's mouth curved in a humorless smile. They didn't account for evidence that wasn't available during those proceedings. They thought I was broken without resources or fight. They'll discover I've only just begun. Jonathan studied her with professional assessment. Jessica will attempt to portray you as a woman struggling with aging, bitter about a failed marriage, unable to adapt to company evolution. How will you counter that narrative? By being exactly what they fear most. A woman who knows her worth and refuses to accept their definition of her value. Ellie gestured toward the harbor view. The world tries to make women like me invisible after 50, assumes our ambitions died with our youth. Richard and Jessica banked on that cultural blindness. Their mistake was forgetting who built the Montgomery legacy while they were still in college. As Jonathan departed, promising updates on the hearing preparations, Ellie returned to the window. Across the harbor, cranes silhouetted against the evening sky marked ongoing development projects, several initiated under her leadership before Richard's takeover. The city continued growing, transforming, adapting to new demands while honoring its historical foundation. She would do the same. The following morning brought unexpected clarity as Ellie reviewed company financial reports obtained through Jonathan's discovery requests. Richard had made critical errors in his rush to implement changes, shifting investment strategies from the patient, quality-focused approach that had defined Montgomery Estates toward flashier, higher-risk ventures promising immediate returns. The signature Montgomery development philosophy had always prioritized architectural integrity and community integration over maximum profit extraction. Under Richard's direction, this was being systematically abandoned in favor of luxury properties with minimal consideration for urban context. The board had approved these changes, convinced by Richard's charismatic presentations and Jessica's legal assurances. Ellie began making notes for Jonathan. The company's deviation from established business practices could strengthen their case that Richard's leadership constituted harmful change rather than necessary evolution. The Montgomery reputation for ethical development had commercial value. Its diminishment represented tangible damage. A text message interrupted her work. Catherine, her middle child, requesting a meeting. Ellie stared at the phone, hope and wariness battling for dominance. Catherine had been distant since the divorce, influenced by Richard's narrative of her mother's supposed instability. This unexpected outreach might represent the first crack in his careful manipulation of her children. They arranged to meet at a small cafe in Cambridge neutral territory, away from Richard's likely surveillance. Ellie arrived early, selecting a corner table with good visibility of the entrance. When Catherine appeared, the physical changes shocked Ellie. Her daughter looked thin shadows beneath her eyes, suggesting sleepless nights. "Mother?" Catherine's formal greeting couldn't mask her nervous energy as she slid into the opposite chair. "Thank you for meeting me." Ellie restrained herself from commenting on Catherine's appearance, maintaining the composed demeanor that had become her armor. "I'm always available to you, Catherine. That hasn't changed." Catherine studied the menu with unnecessary intensity, clearly gathering courage. "Richard has been making changes at the company. The waterfront project you initiated, he's modified the plans. The affordable housing component has been eliminated, replaced with luxury condos. The community center is now a private club." The revelation didn't surprise Ellie, but Catherine's obvious distress offered a glimmer of hope. Her daughter, an architect who had always shared Ellie's vision for ethical urban development, was witnessing the dismantling of Montgomery values firsthand. That project was designed to honor our commitment to mixed-income communities, a Montgomery principle for 3 generations. "What does the board say?" Catherine's laugh held no humor. "The board doesn't challenge Richard anymore, not since Jessica joined as general counsel. They approve whatever he presents." William tried questioning the waterfront changes, and Richard suggested he might be too emotionally attached to outdated concepts to contribute effectively. So William is noticing discrepancies too. The information was valuable, not just personally, but strategically. If Richard was alienating both children who worked in the company, his control might be less secure than it appeared. Catherine hesitated, loyalty visibly warring with growing doubt. "He's concerned. But Richard reminds him that the company needs to evolve, that you are resistant to necessary changes. William wants to believe we're moving in the right direction." Ellie nodded, careful to keep accusation from her tone. "Evolution is necessary in any business. But there's a difference between progress and abandoning core principles. The Montgomery name has always represented more than profit margins." Catherine's eyes filled unexpectedly. "I miss your perspective. The office feels different now, competitive, tense. Richard's brought in his own people, sidelined anyone connected to your leadership. Jessica reviews everything, even design concepts that should be purely creative decisions. The opening was perfect, a natural bridge to the questions Ellie needed answered. I've been reviewing some of the company changes that happened before I left. There were documents I apparently signed that I don't remember. Restructuring papers, transfer agreements. Did you ever witness Richard asking me to sign things at home, especially after Uncle David died? Catherine's expression shifted, memory visibly surfacing. He brought papers to the house constantly those last few months. Said he was lightening your load during a difficult time. You seemed disoriented sometimes. We thought it was grief and the medication. William and I were worried, but Richard insisted he was handling everything. Did you ever see what those documents were? Ellie kept her voice gentle, treating the conversation as natural concern rather than evidence gathering. No, but... Catherine lowered her voice. I saw Jessica at the house one evening when you were asleep. She and Richard were in the study with papers spread across your desk. When I asked what they were working on so late, Richard said it was protection planning, ensuring the company wouldn't suffer if your condition worsened. Catherine's testimony could prove invaluable. Evidence of Richard and Jessica working together on company documents while Ellie was medicated and unaware. Jonathan would need a formal deposition, but this initial conversation opened the door. I wasn't suffering from any condition beyond grief and prescribed medication, Catherine. I believe Richard and Jessica may have taken advantage of that period to transfer company control without my informed consent. Catherine's posture stiffened, defensive barriers rising. That's a serious accusation, Mother. Richard has been good to us, maintained our positions even when others questioned nepotism. He needed you and William to maintain the illusion of family continuity while he dismantled everything your grandfather built. Ellie softened her tone, recognizing her daughter's vulnerability. I'm not asking you to take sides today. Just consider whether the changes you're witnessing align with the company values you were raised to uphold. The meeting ended with tentative plans to speak again, Catherine clearly conflicted but no longer completely under Richard's influence. As Ellie watched her daughter leave, a mixture of maternal concern and strategic calculation colored her thoughts. Catherine could be a crucial ally in revealing Richard's manipulation, if she could be brought to recognize the extent of his deception. Back at her apartment, Ellie found a package delivered by courier, documents from the forensic accountant Jonathan had engaged to examine Montgomery Estate's financial records since Richard's takeover. The findings confirmed her suspicions. Significant funds had been diverted to subsidiary companies where Richard held majority interest, structured as development partnerships, but functioning essentially as cash extractions. Most damning was evidence that Jessica had received special counsel fees, far exceeding standard legal compensation, nearly $2 million in the 18 months preceding Ellie's ouster. The payments had been disguised as expenses for multiple projects, avoiding scrutiny by being parceled across different budgets. Ellie called Jonathan immediately. We need to add financial fraud to the complaint. The funds diverted would have triggered board notification requirements if presented honestly. They deliberately obscured the amounts to avoid oversight. Jonathan's response was measured but encouraging. This strengthens our position considerably. Judge Martinez has a background in financial law. She'll understand the implications immediately. I'll amend our filing tomorrow. The weeks leading to the preliminary hearing passed in a blur of preparation. Ellie divided her time between document analysis meetings with Jonathan's team and careful, controlled reemergence into Boston society. She accepted select invitations to cultural events, presenting herself as composed and forward-looking rather than bitter or defeated. The narrative Richard had cultivated about her emotional instability began to fray as former associates encountered the same strategic thinker they had always respected, now tempered by adversity, into something even more formidable. Rebecca Wilson proved an unexpected social ally, introducing Ellie to financial leaders who had never fully bought Richard's version of events. A quiet counter-narrative began circulating through Boston's elite circles. Questions about the Montgomery Estates, restructuring whispers about Richard's inexperience, and increasingly erratic project decisions. The morning of the hearing arrived crisp and clear, autumn painting Boston Common in brilliant golds and reds. Ellie dressed with deliberate care, a tailored navy suit that conveyed authority without aggression, minimal jewelry that suggested confidence rather than display. Her silver hair, now cut in a modern, sophisticated style, framed a face that revealed none of the anxiety churning beneath her composed exterior. Jonathan met her at the courthouse steps, his team of associates forming a protective phalanx against the financial reporters who had gotten wind of the case. The story had begun generating interest beyond legal circles. The female executive, fighting to reclaim her company from a younger ex-husband, tapped into current conversations about gender power and aging in corporate America. Inside the courtroom, Ellie maintained perfect composure as she took her seat at the plaintiff's table. She had anticipated Richard and Jessica's presence, but was unprepared for the jolt of seeing them together in professional solidarity, their personal discord carefully concealed behind matching expressions of dismissive confidence. Richard had aged subtly in the months since she'd last seen him, new lines around his mouth suggesting strain beneath his maintained facade of success. Jessica appeared immaculate as always, her expression revealing nothing as she arranged documents with practiced efficiency. Judge Diana Martinez entered the courtroom, her reputation for intolerance of legal gamesmanship preceding her. At 61, she represented the generation of female jurists who had fought through systemic barriers, creating space for women in a profession that had actively excluded them. Ellie noted the judge's assessing gaze as it moved between the parties, lingering briefly on the age disparity between herself and Richard. The preliminary arguments proceeded with technical precision, Jessica arguing that the divorce settlement had conclusively addressed all company ownership matters, that reopening these issues constituted harassment rather than legitimate legal challenge. Her presentation was flawless, her logic seemingly unassailable. Until Jonathan rose to respond. "Your Honor, this isn't about revisiting a divorce settlement. This is about systematic corporate fraud perpetrated through document forgery, exploitation of medical vulnerability, and financial misrepresentation." Jonathan presented the forensic evidence methodically, signature discrepancies, medication records correlating with key document dates, the hidden payments to Jessica disguised across multiple budgets. Judge Martinez reviewed the evidence with careful attention, her questions precise and probing. Her focus on the financial disclosures particularly discomfited Jessica, whose expertise should have prevented such obvious irregularities. When Jonathan presented Catherine's sworn statement regarding Richard and Jessica working on documents while Ellie was medicated and unaware, Richard visibly flinched. The betrayal clearly caught him unprepared. He had not anticipated Catherine breaking ranks even in this limited capacity. The judge's ruling came without hesitation. There is sufficient evidence to warrant full discovery and deposition of all parties. Additionally, I'm ordering a forensic audit of Montgomery Estates' financial transactions for the past 3 years to be conducted by an independent firm appointed by the court. This case will proceed to full hearing. As they exited the courtroom, Ellie caught Richard's gaze, his expression a mixture of shock and dawning recognition that the woman he had dismissed as past her prime was systematically dismantling his ill-gotten gains. Jessica appeared less surprised but noticeably tense, professional calculation evident as she assessed this unexpected setback. Outside reporters clustered for comments. Jonathan deflected questions with practiced skill, while Ellie maintained dignified silence, her poised demeanor communicating more than words could about her confidence in the proceedings. One persistent journalist broke through the protective circle. "Mrs. Montgomery, how does it feel to be fighting your ex-husband for control of your family's company at your age?" The ageist implication hung in the air, a perfect demonstration of the cultural assumptions Richard had exploited. Ellie paused, turning to face the camera directly. Age brings perspective that youth can't access, the ability to distinguish between temporary victory and lasting legacy. "My father-in-law built this company on principles that transcend quarterly profits. I'm not fighting for control. I'm fighting for continuation of values that defined Montgomery Estates for generations before Richard Barrett arrived and will endure long after today's headlines fade." The quote appeared in the financial press the following morning, resonating beyond the specific case to touch broader conversations about succession planning, corporate values, and the dismissal of experienced leadership in favor of younger, often male replacements. Ellie had inadvertently tapped into a cultural moment, becoming a focal point for discussions about women's continued relevance beyond conventional career timelines. Jonathan called early, voice animated with unusual enthusiasm. "Your courthouse statement has generated significant attention. 3 board members have reached out through back channels expressing concern about Richard's leadership and the company's direction. They're requesting private meetings." Ellie processed this development, recognizing its strategic importance while remaining cautious about motivation. The board had unanimously supported Richard during her removal. Their current hesitation likely stemmed from self-interest rather than moral awakening. "Arrange the meetings but separately. I want to understand each member's individual concerns rather than their collective position. And let's prepare updated financials showing the company's performance under my leadership versus Richard's. Numbers speak when loyalty wavers." The first board meeting, with Thomas Whitfield, the longest-serving member, occurred that afternoon at Jonathan's office. Whitfield arrived visibly uncomfortable, his usual corporate confidence diminished by the awkwardness of his position. "Eleanor, I want to be clear that I'm here unofficially. The board stands behind Richard's leadership officially, but certain developments have raised questions about the transition process." Ellie nodded, keeping her expression neutral. Developments such as potential document fraud, concealed payments to counsel, and abandonment of core business principles that built our reputation over 3 generations. Whitfield's discomfort increased, his fingers fidgeting with his tie. "The financial audit Judge Martinez ordered. It will reveal irregularities the board wasn't informed about. Jessica assured us all documentation from the transition was properly executed with your full knowledge and approval. And you believe that a woman who built Montgomery Estates into what it is today would voluntarily surrender control without securing her financial future or maintaining quality oversight." Ellie allowed disbelief to color her tone, watching Whitfield's assumptions crumble under direct confrontation. "Richard presented compelling evidence of your difficulties. Medical reports suggesting cognitive decline, emotional instability following your brother's death. We were concerned about the company's stability. The manufactured evidence landed like a physical blow. Richard had apparently gone beyond manipulation into outright medical fabrication." Jonathan, anticipating this revelation, smoothly produced Ellie's actual medical records, along with statements from her physicians confirming no cognitive issues had ever been diagnosed or even suggested. Whitfield reviewed this documentation, his expression transitioning from discomfort to genuine alarm. "This contradicts everything Richard provided to justify the emergency restructuring. If these are your authentic medical records, Then Richard presented fraudulent information to justify a hostile takeover of a privately held family company." Jonathan completed the thought, his tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. "The board made decisions based on deliberate misrepresentation which exposes all members to potential liability. The veiled threat achieved its purpose." Whitfield straightened, self-preservation overriding loyalty to Richard. "What would you need from the board to resolve this situation without public scandal?" "Full restoration of Eleanor Montgomery's position, removal of Richard Barrett from all leadership roles, and a complete audit of decisions made during his tenure." Jonathan's terms were unequivocal, allowing no negotiation. "Additionally, Jessica Harlow's firm will be removed as counsel with all legal payments during this period, subject to review and potential clawback." Whitfield nodded slowly, corporate pragmatism replacing personal allegiance. "I'll need to discuss this with other members, but speaking for myself, a quiet resolution seems preferable to extended litigation and public scrutiny. Richard's recent project decisions have been concerning. The waterfront development changes particularly troubled several of us." After Whitfield departed, Ellie allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The board's support had been Richard's primary advantage. With that foundation cracking, his position became increasingly precarious. Similar meetings with 2 other board members yielded comparable results. Initial discomfort giving way to self-protective distancing from Richard's leadership. By week's end, a clear majority of the board appeared ready to negotiate, rather than risk association with fraudulent business practices. Jonathan's strategy had shifted accordingly, focusing on leveraging this advantage while maintaining pressure through the court proceedings. The forensic audit continued, revealing financial irregularities, each discovery strengthening their position. Unexpectedly, William requested a meeting, not at the office or Ellie's apartment, but at their grandfather Robert Montgomery's grave in Mount Auburn Cemetery. The location choice spoke volumes about her son's emotional state, suggesting a reconnection with family legacy over recent corporate allegiances. Ellie arrived to find William already there, standing before the imposing Montgomery family monument. At 38, he carried the physical resemblance to his grandfather that had once been his pride, the same strong profile and thoughtful eyes now shadowed with uncertainty. "I found documents in Richard's office." William spoke without preamble, his gaze fixed on the granite marker. "Drafts of restructuring proposals dating back to when you first introduced him to the company, long before your marriage. He was planning this from the beginning." Ellie absorbed this confirmation without visible reaction, though it validated her deepest suspicions about Richard's calculated approach to their relationship. The personal betrayal had always mattered less than the professional theft, but learning that their entire marriage had been strategic rather than emotional carried its own unique sting. "There's more." William finally turned to face her directly. "Jessica was his lawyer before you hired her for Montgomery Estates. She represented him in his divorce from Rebecca 5 years earlier, a connection they concealed when you brought her into the company. This revelation carried greater legal significance. an undisclosed prior relationship constituting clear conflict of interest. Jonathan would need this information immediately, as it established a pattern of deliberate deception predating the documents in question. Catherine found the waterfront project changes. William continued his professional composure cracking to reveal genuine distress. Everything that made it special, the community integration, the historical preservation elements, the mixed-income housing, all gone. It's becoming a gated luxury enclave with no public access to the waterfront. Everything grandfather and father fought against in urban development. The Montgomery development philosophy had always centered on responsible urban integration, creating spaces that enhanced communities rather than isolated wealth. Richard's changes represented more than profit-seeking. They constituted repudiation of the principles that had defined the company's reputation. "I've been blind, Mother, willfully blind." Richard positioned himself as the progressive visionary, you as the outdated traditionalist resistant to necessary change. "I wanted to believe we were moving forward, not betraying our foundation." Ellie allowed the moment to breathe, recognizing her son's moral struggle demanded space rather than immediate absolution. The monument behind them represented 4 generations of Montgomery builders, men and women who had shaped Boston's landscape through Depression war and economic transformation without abandoning their core principles. Forward movement without ethical foundation isn't progress, William. It's drift. Every generation must adapt to changing markets and social needs, but adaptation shouldn't require abandoning the values that distinguished us from mere developers. William nodded, his expression clearing as something fundamental realigned within him. "Catherine and I have discussed approaching the board together, presenting a united front against Richard's direction. We believe several members are already questioning his leadership." Ellie shared the developments from her meetings with board members, watching William's professional assessment override familial loyalty as he calculated the shifting power dynamics. His business acumen had always been his strength, the ability to analyze situations dispassionately, separate emotional entanglements from strategic necessities. "We should coordinate our approaches." William's decisive tone reflected the executive he had become. "Catherine and I can address the business consequences of Richard's leadership directly with the board, while your legal team continues pursuing the fraud aspects. A 2-pronged strategy increases pressure from multiple directions." As they walked through the cemetery's winding paths, autumn leaves crunching beneath their feet, William outlined his observations of the company's deterioration under Richard's leadership. Decreasing employee retention damaged relationships with longtime development partners, erosion of the quality standards that had distinguished Montgomery projects. More concerning was Richard's increasingly erratic decision-making, committing to projects without proper assessment, alienating key municipal contacts through arrogance, dismissing experienced team members who questioned his approach. The pattern suggested someone prioritizing short-term visibility over sustainable growth. He's extracting value rather than building it. William's assessment was blunt professional distance, allowing clarity about a man he had briefly accepted as family. "The projects generating immediate returns were initiated under your leadership. He's accelerating completion to claim credit while neglecting foundation work for future development. It's corporate strip mining." Their conversation shifted to practical strategy, how William and Catherine could best support the legal case while maintaining their positions within the company. Their insider access provided valuable intelligence about Richard's ongoing decisions and potential vulnerabilities, especially as pressure mounted from multiple directions. When William departed, promising to coordinate with Catherine before approaching the board formally, Ellie remained at the cemetery, seeking a moment of reflection before returning to the apartment. The family plot contained 4 generations of Montgomerys, each headstone marking not just a life completed, but a contribution to the city visible in buildings, parks, and community spaces throughout Boston. Maxwell's grave stood slightly apart, his preference for distinction evident even in death. Ellie traced her fingers over the simple inscription, "Builder of Legacies." The double meaning had always seemed appropriate for a man who constructed both physical edifices and family traditions designed to outlast any individual achievement. He had understood something fundamental about wealth and power. Their true value lay not in temporary display, but in sustainable foundation. The hidden account reflected this philosophy perfectly. Resources preserved against future need rather than deployed for immediate recognition. Ellie had absorbed that lesson through their years working together, but Richard represented its antithesis, extracting immediate benefit without concern for long-term consequences, prioritizing appearance over substance. The contrast couldn't be more stark, nor the choice facing Montgomery Estates more consequential. The confrontation building between them transcended personal grievance or corporate control. It represented competing visions of legacy itself. Richard sought to dismantle and monetize what 3 generations had built. Ellie fought to preserve and evolve the Montgomery tradition of ethical development that considered community impact alongside profit potential. Returning to her apartment, Ellie found a message from Jonathan. The forensic audit had uncovered evidence that Richard had been systematically inflating his performance metrics through accounting manipulations, creating an illusion of success, while actual project profitability declined. The independent auditors had flagged multiple instances where costs were deferred or improperly allocated to enhance short-term results. More significantly, they'd discovered communications between Richard and Jessica discussing how to structure these manipulations to avoid board scrutiny. Explicit evidence of collusion that extended beyond the original fraud allegations into ongoing financial misrepresentation. Jonathan's assessment was uncharacteristically emotional. "We've got them, Eleanor. This isn't just about your removal anymore. It's about active ongoing fraud against the company and shareholders. The board won't have any choice but to act once these findings become official." Ellie absorbed this development with measured satisfaction. Richard's desperation to prove himself worthy of his position had led to shortcuts and deceptions that now undermined his carefully constructed facade. The truth was emerging not through her accusations, but through independent verification of his actual performance. She considered Maxwell's journal entry about true wealth residing in what remains hidden, resources others don't know you possess. Richard had dismissed her as a spent force, a woman whose power had expired with her youth and marriage. In doing so, he had failed to recognize her most valuable assets remained invisible patience, cultivated through decades of business navigation relationships built on genuine respect rather than expedience, and an understanding of legacy that transcended quarterly performance metrics. As evening settled over Boston, Ellie stood at her apartment window watching lights illuminate across the harbor. The Montgomery building's distinctive copper dome gleamed in the distance, a beacon of continuity amid constant urban evolution. Richard currently occupied the executive office beneath that dome, but his tenure was proving as insubstantial as his commitment had been. The coming confrontation would determine not just company control, but the Montgomery future. Whether the legacy Maxwell and subsequent generations had built would continue evolving with purpose or be dismantled for immediate profit. Ellie had lost her marriage temporarily, lost her company, and briefly lost her children's trust, but she had never lost sight of what truly mattered, the principles that distinguished building from mere construction development, from simple profit extraction. Tomorrow would bring William and Catherine's presentation to the board, Jonathan's filing of additional evidence with Judge Martinez, and the next phase of reclaiming what rightfully belonged not just to Ellie personally, but to the Montgomery tradition of responsible development. Richard had misjudged not only her resilience, but the enduring power of the legacy he had attempted to appropriate, a legacy that would ultimately prove his undoing. "Women like me aren't finished at 60, Ellie thought, watching a ship navigate the harbor's challenging currents with practiced skill. "We've simply learned to navigate troubled waters without unnecessary motion, to recognize which battles deserve our energy and which obstacles are merely temporary." Richard mistook my patience for weakness, my consideration for indecision. His education continues. The Montgomery Building's boardroom had witnessed decades of consequential decisions, its mahogany table bearing the subtle marks of 3 generations' deliberations. Today, that legacy of careful stewardship faced its most significant challenge, as board members assembled for what had been described as an emergency strategic assessment. The air hung heavy with tension as William and Catherine Montgomery stood together at the presentation screen, their unexpected alliance commanding attention before they spoke a single word. Ellie observed from the visitors' gallery, maintaining a deliberate distance from the proceedings. Her presence, poised, attentive, but silent, served as physical reminder of what had been dismissed. She had chosen her position carefully visible to the board without appearing to direct her children's presentation. This was their moment to reclaim their voices within the company. Richard entered last, Jessica trailing slightly behind him. The strain of recent weeks showed in the tightness around his mouth, the defensive set of his shoulders. His customary confident stride had shortened his gaze, darting briefly toward Ellie, before focusing with visible surprise on William and Catherine, standing united at the front of the room. Board Chairman Douglas Mercer called the meeting to order, his tone carefully neutral, despite the undercurrent of discomfort permeating the room. "William, Catherine, You've requested this extraordinary session to address concerns about company direction. The floor is yours. William stepped forward every inch the executive his grandfather had groomed him to be. Behind his professional demeanor, Ellie recognized the determined expression he'd worn as a child, building elaborate structures that could withstand his siblings' attempts to topple them. The presentation began with stark financial analysis, comparing project outcomes under Ellie's leadership with those initiated under Richard's direction. The data revealed systematic deterioration in completion timelines, budget adherence, and most significantly, the quality metrics that had distinguished Montgomery developments for decades. These aren't abstract concerns. William clicked to a slide showing side-by-side materials comparisons. Our Harbor Point development was initially specified with sustainable materials meeting LEED Platinum certification. Under revised directives, these have been downgraded to minimum code requirements, sacrificing our environmental commitments for marginal cost savings. Catherine stepped forward, her architectural expertise lending authority to her assessment. The waterfront project represents the most dramatic departure from Montgomery principles. She displayed the original renderings beside Richard's revisions, the community-integrated design with public spaces transformed into an isolated luxury enclave with restricted access. This redesign violates not just our company traditions, but our contractual commitments to the city regarding waterfront accessibility. We secured approvals based on specific community benefits that have been systematically eliminated. Richard shifted in his seat, glancing toward Jessica, whose expression remained professionally impassive, despite the mounting evidence against their management approach. When William transitioned to financial slides revealing the accounting manipulations identified by the forensic audit, Jessica's composure finally cracked, her pen tapping an accelerating rhythm against her legal pad. The board members' reactions evolved from initial skepticism to growing concern as the presentation continued. Thomas Whitfield leaned forward, focusing intently on projection figures, showing long-term revenue implications of Richard's short-term approaches. The institutional knowledge Ellie had cultivated in these men was reasserting itself. Recognition that what they were witnessing wasn't merely leadership transition friction, but fundamental abandonment of the principles that had sustained Montgomery Estates through market fluctuations for 3 generations. Richard remained silent throughout the presentation, his strategy apparently to weather the criticism without engaging directly. When William concluded the formal portion, however, Chairman Mercer turned expectantly toward the current CEO. "Richard, these allegations are serious. The board would appreciate your perspective on these findings." Richard rose, straightening his tie in a gesture Ellie recognized as his preparation for persuasive performance. His smile appeared relaxed, though it didn't reach his eyes. Change is always uncomfortable, particularly in family companies with established traditions. What William and Catherine have presented as deterioration is actually modernization, necessary adaptations to current market demands and investor expectations. He moved toward the screen, reclaiming physical dominance of the space. Our clients increasingly demand luxury amenities and exclusivity. The community integration elements Catherine mourns were admirable social experiments, but demonstrated limited return on investment. Montgomery Estates exists to generate profit, not serve as a municipal planning office. Catherine's shoulders stiffened, professional restraint battling familial indignation. The Montgomery reputation was built on ethical development that considered community impact alongside profitability. That balance created the brand value you're currently extracting for short-term gains. Richard's expression hardened the facade of reasonable discussion, slipping. "Sentimentality is expensive, Catherine. The market doesn't pay premiums for good intentions." William interjected, redirecting attention to the financial exhibits. "Sentimentality doesn't explain these accounting irregularities. Multiple projects show costs improperly allocated across fiscal periods to create artificial performance improvements. That's not modernization. It's misrepresentation." The board's focus sharpened at this transition from philosophical differences to potential malfeasance. Richard's confident posture faltered momentarily as he glanced toward Jessica, whose legal pad now contained rapid notations. Every development company utilizes timing strategies for cost recognition. Jessica's voice carried practiced authority despite her defensive position. These accounting approaches were reviewed by our financial team and external auditors. Board member Elizabeth Chen, whose background in corporate finance made her particularly attentive to such matters, tapped a manicured nail against the audit report. "The independent forensic auditors disagree with that assessment, Ms. Harlow. They've flagged multiple instances where timing strategies crossed into improper deferral, creating misleading quarterly results." The discussion escalated technical questions, revealing board members' growing skepticism about Richard's explanations. What had begun as a presentation about philosophical direction had transformed into scrutiny of specific actions potentially constituting financial misconduct. With each exchange, Richard's responses grew more defensive, his earlier composure fracturing under precise questioning. Ellie maintained her silent observation, noting the shifting dynamics with experienced eyes. The board members were distancing themselves from Richard's decisions, their questions increasingly framed to establish their own lack of knowledge about the questionable practices being revealed. When Chairman Mercer called a brief recess, Richard and Jessica immediately huddled in urgent consultation at the far end of the room. Their body language revealed the strain between them. Richard's gestures accusatory, Jessica's responses clipped and defensive. William approached Ellie in the visitors' gallery, keeping his voice low. The financial evidence is having greater impact than we anticipated. 3 board members have already indicated they'll support leadership change if the audit findings are confirmed. Catherine joined them, her professional demeanor momentarily giving way to the daughter seeking confirmation. Do you think it's enough Mother Richard still has support from Hendricks and Lowell? Ellie considered the question with the strategic assessment she'd applied to business challenges for decades. We don't need unanimous support today. Just sufficient concern to authorize the special committee review, Jonathan recommended. Once they have full access to the documentation, Richard's position becomes untenable. The board reconvened with heightened tension, several members now physically positioned farther from Richard at the table, a subtle but significant indication of shifting allegiances. Chairman Mercer called for discussion of immediate actions regarding the audit findings. Given the seriousness of these financial discrepancies, I move that we establish a special review committee with full investigative authority. Thomas Whitfield's proposal hung in the air, the formal motion transforming vague concerns into potential action. This committee should have unfettered access to all financial records and decision documentation for the past 18 months. Richard's objection came swiftly. This is premature and potentially disruptive to ongoing operations. The audit findings require context and explanation, which my team is prepared to provide through normal channels. Elizabeth Chen countered immediately. Normal channels appear to have been insufficient for proper oversight during the transition period. If these findings are indeed explainable, a special committee will confirm that. If not, the board has fiduciary responsibility to address any irregularities promptly. The vote that followed revealed the extent of Richard's eroding support. 7 members supporting the special committee, only 2 opposing. His expression remained carefully controlled, but the muscle twitching in his jaw betrayed the rage simmering beneath his professional veneer. Chairman Mercer appointed Whitfield, Chen, and himself to the special committee, further isolating Richard from the investigative process. We'll begin immediately with findings to be presented at an emergency session next week. In the meantime, all major financial decisions require committee approval. The effective suspension of Richard's authority, though technically temporary, represented a devastating blow to his carefully constructed control. As the meeting adjourned, Ellie caught his gaze across the room, his eyes cold with fury and something approaching disbelief that the woman he had dismissed as irrelevant had orchestrated such a comprehensive challenge to his position. Outside the boardroom, Jonathan Fisher waited with the composure of a man accustomed to corporate battlefields. The board's decision created exactly the opening they needed for the legal strategy they'd been developing. Corporate governance concerns providing additional leverage beyond the personal fraud allegations. The special committee authorization gives us access to documentation we couldn't reach through normal discovery. Jonathan's satisfaction remained professional rather than triumphant. Richard can no longer control what information reaches the board or how it's presented. Ellie nodded, maintaining her own measured response despite the significant victory. We should prepare for countermeasures. Richard won't surrender control without deploying every resource at his disposal. Her prediction proved accurate sooner than expected. That evening, as Ellie reviewed documentation for the upcoming court hearing, her phone lit with a call from Jennifer, her youngest daughter who had remained distant throughout the conflict, her position at a Chicago architectural firm physically and emotionally removed from the family struggle. "Mother, I've just had the strangest call from Richard." Jennifer's voice carried confusion rather than the hostility Ellie had come to expect. "He offered to fund a new design studio for me, said he values my architectural vision and wants to support my independence from family dynamics. When I asked about the timing, he mentioned you might be sharing concerning stories about him that I shouldn't take at face value." The transparent attempt to secure Jennifer's loyalty through financial manipulation confirmed Richard's growing desperation. Unable to maintain his position through business performance or board confidence, he had resorted to dividing the children whose reunification represented his most significant threat. Richard's offering money he no longer controls. Ellie kept her tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. The board has restricted his financial authority pending investigation of accounting irregularities. William and Catherine presented evidence today that has triggered a special review committee. Jennifer's silence conveyed her processing this new information. So his sudden interest in my career advancement isn't coincidental. It's a tactical response to losing William and Catherine's support. Richard recognizes that a united Montgomery family presents an existential threat to his position. Divide and conquer is his only remaining strategy. The conversation continued, Jennifer asking increasingly specific questions about the company's situation and Richard's management decisions. Unlike her siblings, Jennifer had never worked directly for Montgomery Estates, her architectural career developing independently in a firm known for innovative urban renewal projects. Her perspective came without the emotional complications of daily company involvement. Before ending the call, Jennifer's tone shifted from inquiry to decision. I'm flying to Boston tomorrow. This isn't just about corporate control anymore. It's about family legacy and ethical business practices. I need to see the evidence firsthand before deciding where I stand. The unexpected support from her youngest daughter, historically the most independent and least involved in family business matters, provided validation Ellie hadn't realized she needed. The professional recognition from board members and legal experts mattered less than her children's gradual recognition of the principles at stake beyond personal grievances. Jonathan's team worked through the night preparing for the court hearing, incorporating the board's special committee authorization into their filings. The judge's chambers had indicated particular interest in the forensic handwriting analysis of the disputed signatures, evidence that would directly address Richard and Jessica's central claim that Ellie had knowingly approved all company restructuring. Morning brought another unexpected development. Michael Donovan, the private investigator, delivered recordings from the Four Seasons bar where Richard and Jessica had been meeting with increasing frequency as pressure mounted. Their recent conversation revealed escalating tension between the conspirators as their unified front began crumbling. You promised the board would never see those accounting adjustments. Richard's voice, slightly slurred from alcohol, carried accusatory heat. Now they're establishing a special committee with full access to everything. Jessica's response came with clipped precision. I advised creating better documentation for the timing strategies. You chose expediency over proper cover. Don't blame me for your shortcuts. The recording continued their argument, escalating to reveal Richard's growing financial desperation, gambling debts, extensive borrowing against company assets, personal expenditures far exceeding his official compensation. Most significantly, Jessica mentioned contingency planning, including offshore accounts established to shelter funds if the situation deteriorated further. This is potentially criminal activity. Jonathan's assessment carried appropriate gravity. Financial misrepresentation to a publicly traded company would fall under SEC jurisdiction. Ellie considered this new dimension, weighing personal vindication against broader company implications. The Montgomery reputation had been built on ethical business practices sustained across generations. Public scandal involving securities fraud could damage that legacy beyond her ability to repair. We use this information strategically. Leverage for settlement rather than public exposure. Her decision reflected the long-term perspective Maxwell had instilled. The goal isn't public humiliation, but appropriate restoration and company protection. Jonathan nodded, his own reputation built on achieving results without unnecessary destruction. I'll prepare settlement parameters that include Richard's complete separation from the company financial restitution and binding non-disclosure agreements. The courthouse steps presented a markedly different tableau than the previous hearing. Where Ellie had once stood with only Jonathan and his team, she now arrived accompanied by all three of her children. William, Catherine, and Jennifer presenting unified family presence that attracted immediate media attention. Richard and Jessica entered separately, their previously coordinated approach visibly fractured. Jessica maintained professional composure, but Richard's appearance had deteriorated, his usually immaculate presentation showing subtle signs of strain in his rumpled suit and shadowed eyes. Judge Martinez noted the expanded attendance with a raised eyebrow, but proceeded directly to the evidence review. The forensic document examiner presented detailed analysis of the disputed signatures, methodically demonstrating inconsistencies in multiple key transfers that had facilitated Richard's control. Most damning was evidence showing several signatures dated during periods when Ellie's medical records confirmed she was under significant medication following her brother's death. medication that affected cognitive function and would have impaired her ability to make informed financial decisions. The pharmaceutical expert testified that the specific combination of anti-anxiety medication and sleep aids prescribed during this period would have made Ellie particularly vulnerable to manipulation, creating a state where she might physically sign documents without full comprehension or later memory of their contents. Richard's attorney attempted to counter with arguments about Ellie's business sophistication and responsibility to review documents regardless of personal circumstances, but Judge Martinez's expression reflected growing skepticism about this defense. When Jonathan introduced Catherine's sworn statement regarding witnessing Richard and Jessica working with company documents while Ellie was medicated, and unaware Richard visibly flinched. The betrayal by his former ally clearly caught him unprepared. He had not anticipated Catherine providing testimony that directly contradicted his narrative of transparent business transition. Your Honor, this evidence clearly establishes a pattern of exploitation during a period of documented vulnerability. Jonathan's summary was measured but unequivocal. Mrs. Montgomery was systematically deprived of company control through deceptive practices while experiencing grief and under medical treatment that affected her capacity for informed consent. Judge Martinez reviewed the assembled evidence with methodical attention, her questions revealing thorough engagement with both the legal and ethical dimensions of the case. Her focus on the timeline correlating Ellie's medication with key document executions particularly discomfited Richard's legal team, whose arguments grew increasingly technical rather than substantive. The court will take these matters under advisement. Judge Martinez's tone conveyed more than her neutral words. However, given the compelling nature of the forensic evidence presented today, I'm issuing an immediate injunction, freezing all major company decisions pending final ruling. Mr. Barrett is temporarily restricted from executing any financial transactions exceeding $50,000 without explicit board approval. The temporary injunction represented a devastating blow to Richard's already diminished authority, a judicial confirmation of the board's concerns that would accelerate his isolation within the company he had schemed to control. Outside the courtroom, reporters clustered for comments. Jonathan fielded most questions with professional discretion, while Ellie maintained dignified silence. When one persistent journalist directly addressed Richard with questions about document authenticity, his composed facade finally cracked. This is a vindictive campaign by a woman who couldn't accept natural business evolution. Richard's voice carried throughout the courthouse corridor, his controlled professional image disintegrating under pressure. Eleanor Montgomery is attempting to reclaim relevance she lost years ago. The company outgrew her limited vision. The outburst created exactly the contrast Ellie had carefully avoided: emotional reactivity versus composed determination. Without responding directly to his accusations, she simply turned toward her assembled children, their physical presence beside her, providing more eloquent rebuttal than any verbal defense could offer. Back at her apartment, Jonathan outlined next steps based on the hearing's favorable outcome. The court's temporary restrictions combined with the board's special committee created unprecedented leverage for negotiation. Richard's position had become effectively untenable. His authority undermined his credibility, questioned his financial dealings under scrutiny from multiple directions. He'll attempt settlement discussions within 48 hours. Jonathan's prediction reflected decades of experience with similar cases. His options are disappearing rapidly, and Jessica has likely advised him that continuing this fight only increases his personal exposure. The prediction proved accurate sooner than expected. That evening, Richard's attorney contacted Jonathan requesting confidential settlement discussions without litigation counsel present, a clear indication that Jessica had distanced herself from Richard's defense as her own professional vulnerability became apparent. I've reviewed the recordings from the 4 seasons. Jonathan's tone reflected appropriate gravity regarding the potentially criminal implications. They contained statements that could trigger securities fraud investigation if they became public. We should consider whether pursuing that avenue serves your ultimate objectives. Ellie considered the question with the same strategic assessment she'd applied throughout her business career, evaluating long-term consequences rather than immediate satisfaction. Richard deserved accountability, but the Montgomery legacy deserved protection from public scandal that would damage the company's reputation beyond her ability to repair. The goal has always been restoration, not destruction. The settlement should ensure Richard's complete separation from the company financial restitution for misappropriated funds and binding confidentiality that protects the Montgomery name from public scandal. The settlement conference occurred at Jonathan's office rather than the courthouse, neutral territory that allowed for candid discussion without public scrutiny. Richard arrived alone, Jessica's absence conspicuous and significant. His earlier belligerence had given way to grim resignation as the comprehensive nature of his defeat became undeniable. The terms Jonathan presented were non-negotiable. Richard would surrender all company positions and ownership interests, return misappropriated funds identified through forensic audit, and sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements, preventing any public discussion of company matters. In exchange, Ellie would not pursue criminal charges regarding document fraud or securities misrepresentation. "I built that company into what it is today." Richard's final attempt at self-justification lacked conviction, his tone revealing awareness of his untenable position. "The strategic vision, the modernization, those were my contributions." Ellie broke her silence for the first time during the proceedings, her voice carrying quiet authority rather than triumph. "You mistook extraction for creation, Richard. The Montgomery legacy was built through generations of ethical development and community investment. What you interpreted as outdated tradition was actually sustainable foundation. You didn't build, you borrowed against foundations others established." Richard's expression revealed the impact of this fundamental truth. Recognition that his vision had always depended on leveraging what others had created rather than establishing independent value. His signature on the settlement documents came with defeated acknowledgement rather than continued resistance. The following week brought formal restoration of Ellie's position through board action based on the special committee's findings. The transition announcement emphasized continuity of Montgomery values rather than personal vindication, focusing on recommitment to ethical development principles that had distinguished the company for generations. William assumed the operational leadership role Ellie had been grooming him for before Richard's interference, while Catherine took charge of design integrity across all projects, returning to the careful balance between profitability and community responsibility that had defined Montgomery developments. Jennifer surprised everyone by requesting 6-month sabbatical from her Chicago firm to oversee restoration of the waterfront project to its original community-integrated design. Her architectural expertise, combined with fresh perspective, untainted by recent corporate conflict, brought renewed energy to what would become a signature Montgomery achievement. The Montgomery Building's executive office had changed little during Richard's brief tenure. He had focused on rapid financial extraction rather than physical transformation of company spaces. Returning to the corner office overlooking Boston Harbor, Ellie found comfort in the familiar surroundings, but recognized that her relationship with the company had fundamentally evolved through recent challenges. Maxwell's portrait still hung on the wall opposite her desk, his expression conveying the same steadfast determination that had guided the company through previous transitions. The hidden account he had established 70 years earlier had served its purpose, providing temporary sanctuary during crisis rather than permanent insulation from reality. Ellie had withdrawn only what was necessary for immediate stability, leaving the core resource intact for future generations who might face their own unexpected challenges. Rebecca Wilson had proven invaluable in managing this transition, her banking expertise helping establish financial protections against similar vulnerability in the future. The Montgomery assets were now structured with multiple safeguards, requiring family consensus for major changes, protecting against individual exploitation while maintaining necessary operational flexibility. 1 month after Richard's departure, Ellie convened family dinner at her apartment. Not to celebrate victory, but to establish renewed foundation for moving forward. The Harbor View dining room accommodated William and Catherine Jennifer home from Chicago, and for the first time, William's teenage children, Alexander and Sophia, who represented the next generation of Montgomery leadership. The conversation flowed naturally from company matters to personal connections, the recent conflict having clarified what truly mattered beyond business success or material acquisition. William's renewed appreciation for his mother's business acumen, Catherine's recognition of the values underlying seemingly traditional approaches, Jennifer's fresh perspective on family legacy. Each represented healing of relationships Richard had deliberately fractured. Later, as the younger generation explored the harbor viewpoint while the adults lingered over coffee, Ellie shared her evolving perspective on the experience that had nearly cost her everything. The greatest threat wasn't Richard's ambition or Jessica's legal maneuvering. It was the cultural assumption that women my age become irrelevant, that our experience loses value rather than compounds interest. Richard exploited that blind spot, knowing people would more readily believe in my decline than recognize his manipulation. Catherine nodded her own professional experience, having revealed similar patterns in architectural leadership, where women past 50 found their expertise increasingly questioned despite growing mastery. What prevented you from doubting yourself when everyone, even family, seemed to accept his narrative? Ellie considered the question that touched on something fundamental about resilience beyond simple determination or financial resources. Maxwell's journal provided foundation, but the real strength came from knowing my own capabilities despite external assessments. Value isn't determined by others' recognition of it, just as that account existed regardless of who knew about it. The conversation shifted toward future-focused planning. How to ensure Montgomery Estates continued evolving while maintaining its defining principles, how to prepare the next generation for leadership without creating entitled expectation, how to balance family connection with meritocratic opportunity. The following morning brought Ellie to the company's flagship development site, where construction had resumed on the original waterfront project design. The community integration elements Richard had eliminated were being restored under Jennifer's supervision. Public green spaces, mixed-income housing components, historical preservation elements that honored the waterfront's industrial heritage while creating contemporary urban connection. The project exemplified the Montgomery approach to development, recognizing that lasting value came from enhancing communities rather than extracting maximum short-term profit. The additional costs Richard had deemed unnecessary represented investment in sustainability that would distinguish Montgomery properties long after quick-profit developments had deteriorated. Jennifer joined her mother at the site overlook architectural plans tucked under her arm. The contractors are adapting quickly to the restored design. We'll need another 2 months for completion, but the community response has been overwhelmingly positive. The local newspaper is planning feature coverage on development with conscience, positioning Montgomery as the counterexample to exploitative urban renewal. Ellie observed the construction activity with satisfaction beyond personal vindication. Richard's approach would have generated faster returns, but created another isolated luxury enclave divorced from Boston's actual community needs. The restored project would establish renewed foundation for the Montgomery reputation as developers who enhanced rather than exploited the urban landscape. The afternoon brought board meeting where Ellie formally announced her transition plan. William, assuming CEO responsibilities while she moved to chairperson role, focused on strategic direction and mentoring the next generation. The succession represented evolution, rather than replacement, maintaining institutional knowledge, while creating space for fresh approaches appropriate for changing markets. The board members who had initially accepted Richard's narrative about her diminished capabilities now demonstrated renewed appreciation for her strategic vision and management approach. Their support for the transition plan came with acknowledgement that recent events had revealed the dangers of prioritizing charismatic presentation over substantive leadership. That evening, alone in her apartment, watching sunset colors transform Boston Harbor, Ellie reflected on the journey from devastation to restoration. The experience had stripped away peripheral concerns, clarifying what truly constituted value beyond material acquisition or social position. The relationships rebuilt with her children, the principles reestablished within the company, the legacy preserved for future generations. These represented sustainable achievements rather than temporary victories. Maxwell's journal lay open on her desk, one passage particularly resonant in light of recent experience. True legacy isn't measured in buildings constructed or fortunes accumulated, but in the principles that survive when everything material has been stripped away. What remains when nothing remains is what truly matters. Richard had nearly succeeded in taking everything that defined her external identity: home, company, financial security, family relationships. What he couldn't access was the internal foundation that defined her essential character, the resilience, strategic thinking, and ethical commitment cultivated through decades of meeting challenges with principled determination rather than expedient compromise. At 63, Eleanor Montgomery wasn't approaching conclusion, but beginning new chapter informed by hard-earned wisdom. The copper dome of the Montgomery building caught final light of day, its distinctive silhouette representing continuity amid constant change. Much like the Montgomery values that had survived their greatest challenge, not through rigid preservation, but through thoughtful evolution, guided by enduring principles. The company would continue developing Boston's landscape through coming decades, each project reflecting balance between necessary adaptation and fundamental values that distinguished building from mere construction. William and Catherine would bring their own perspectives to leadership. Jennifer, her architectural innovation, the next generation, their contemporary understanding of urban needs. Throughout these evolutions, the foundation Maxwell had established, both financial and philosophical, would continue providing stability during inevitable transitions. The hidden account represented more than monetary resource. It embodied approach to legacy that prioritized sustainability over recognition, foundation over facade. Women my age aren't finished, Ellie thought, watching lights illuminate across the harbor as darkness settled. We've simply learned to build with materials that withstand storms, patience perspective principles that transcend temporary advantage. Richard mistook my composure for weakness, my consideration for indecision. His education is complete,